Association. Please go back. Yeah. Machat Ulama Association, a pan-Oromo civic organization which was established in 1963. The objective of Machat Ulama Association was were building schools and clinics and promoting literacy, public health, social and economic development in Oromia. But both the Machat Ulama and the Bali rebellion were violently suppressed by the Haile Selassie regime. The Machat Ulama was banned in 1968, and over 100 of its leaders and members were incarcerated for years. Some of its prominent leaders were killed or died from injuries incurred in prison. The Bali uprising was suppressed in 1970. However, it did not mean the Oromo were coerced to submission. Finally, the cultural and political arrogance of the dominant Amhara elites, the feudal ruling class, who were exploiting the peasant masses without any moral consideration, played a great role in the demise of the imperial regime. In 1973, the regime spent millions of birr to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the Organization of African Unity. The show of the imperial Solomonic attentions was played out while a hidden famine which killed over 200,000 people was ravaging Wollo and southern Tigray. In fact, when exposed, the famine became a major cause of the revolution of 1974 and the last nail in the imperial order's coffin. The two major issues which led to the downfall of the monarchy and which brought the Derg to power promised to the Derg who promised to address was the questions of to address the question of nationalities, the land reform, and the land reform. The Derg addressed these issues. These issues were raised by the student movement, the Ethiopian student movement, throughout the 60s and the beginning of the 1970s. In this program of the National Democratic Revolution, Section 2, under 5, the Derg declared the right of self-determination of all nationalities will be recognized and fully respected. No nationality will dominate another, since the history, culture, language, and religion of each nationality will have equal recognition in accordance with the spirit of socialism. By addressing the national question and recognizing the national identities, for example, Oromo were called no more Galla, and the right of constituent peoples of the empire, the Derg promised the decolonization of, among other things, place names which were changed from Oromo to Amharic or biblical names by the imperial regime. We got back many of the place names. Decolonization, the colonization or the colonial names were changed back to Oromo names. Land reform of March 1975 abolished the landlord's tenant relationship. This destroyed the economic backbone of a vicious land-owning class who oppressed and exploited millions of Oromos for more than a century and made the state the sole owner of the land in the country and the people it is.
Professor Mukra, you do have 5 minutes to conclude. Excuse me.
Okay. To go to my conclusion, I will jump over that then, and to summarize, I go leave other issues. 3 conditions under which people ought to gain independence should be observed anyway. Number 1 is, the first condition concerns history of conquest, annexation, and the colonization of territories by states or empires. Two, the second condition, which is justified, the creation of a new state was prolonged conflict, leading to massive violation of human rights involving a state and a nation or an indigenous group with a specific homeland or territory. The third is the creation of a new state occurs when and where the inhabitants of a sub-state or territory shows the desire to secede from a state or an empire of which they have been a part for a long time. In addition, in the case of Ethiopia, Article 39 of the Ethiopian Constitution grants every nation, nationality, and the people in Ethiopia an unconditional right to self-determination, including the right to secession. I'm bringing these because the Oromo have all this right or gone on through all this through this subjugation and repression by the Ethiopian state. In short, the Oromo people have struggled for the right since their land was conquered by the Abyssinians. As the descendants of the builders of the Gada system, with proud history and cultural heritage, they have the right to exercise their democratic political culture and occupy their rightful place among free and independent nations in the world. To summarize, the Oromo people came under Abyssinian rule not because it is where they chose to be, but because they were conquered and colonized. As such, the Ethiopian rulers have no legal claim on Oromo territories, nor do the Oromo people have any moral obligation to stay within the Ethiopian state that has done incalculable harms that cannot be described here. During the last 4 decades, they gave peace a chance and genuinely participating in efforts to reform the Ethiopian state system and establish a democratic system to live in peace with all peoples, even their perennial tormentors. But these efforts failed disastrously. In general, the Oromo people have paid dearly with precious lives of their sons and daughters, mineral sources, agricultural produce, and wealth to sustain uncaring people and the government. Over the last 150 years, the Ethiopian state that recruited Oromo young men and women to fight its wars while abusing their rights and Oromo peoplehood. The Abyssinian elite have undermined and denigrated Oromo history, culture, and language, and consecutive Ethiopian governments have looted and expropriated Oromo resources to support its progressy and benefit the Abyssinian ruling elite and their agents. The question is, given the irrational and hateful narrative of the Amharic-speaking elite, how could the Oromo people realize a shared government in the same country? They have been conquered, lost their land and freedom, their language and culture, denigrated and despised despite years of repeated abuse. The efforts for peaceful coexistence have been met with deceit and violence. They have been in an abnormal situation for a century and a half, patiently working for and waiting to see change, but have got nothing than dehumanization and violence as described above. By now, it is clear to everyone that the Abyssinian political culture is inherently violent and incapable of reforming and democratizing.
Professor Macrae, you do have only 2 minutes. Excuse me.
Okay. Itself, despite the repeatedly failed attempts at reforming and democratizing the Ethiopian state, Oromo leaders have heavily invested and worked hard to reform it. It is said that a nation tends to produce its state when it faces abnormal situations. Today, when all avenues for mutual respect and shared government within the Ethiopian state are closed, the Oromo people and their leaders have no choice except establishing their own independent government that cares and protects the Oromo and all other residents of Oromia. The Oromo quest for freedom and independence is not only a legitimate decision, but the right of any nation that has been cruelly colonized and abused for a long time. Statehood is a collective aspiration of more than 40 million Oromo people who express demands frequently in popular protests across Oromia for several years and articulated it eloquently in their music, arts, and poetry, and reflected in their politics, observed and registered in numerous news reports and scholarly studies. The Oromo people have a deeply rooted tradition of democracy, a culture of tolerance, and peaceful coexistence with neighbors. They believe in religious diversity and protect the rights of minorities within their society. The Baro Tumsa Institute believes that the establishment of a democratic and independent state of Oromia can serve as a beacon of stability and a model of good governance, not only in the Horn of Africa, but for the whole continent. Thus, there is no justification for the Oromo people to be perpetually held hostage to an authoritarian and undemocratic system. As a descendants of the builders of the Gada system, with proud history and cultural heritage, the Oromo people deserve to be free. They have the right to occupy the rightful place in modern society among free and independent nations of the world. For this reason, the Oromo people must say the time is ripe for establishing an independent state of Oromia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Macrae. That your concluding word is time has come. The conquest, the quest for freedom and independence is a document, 41-page document, which is Baro Tumsa Institute organized and prepared. So each, according to my view, each Oromo children must study and consume this paper and teach their children to have our historical view according to how we lived and what happened to Oromo nation. And it is time, without any alternative, to fight for independence of Oromia. It is a national shame. 40 million people is under the yoke of the cruelest colonial power in African colonial history. Who wanted to falsify what I am saying, let him or her compare German, English, British, Belgian colonialism with Zabasha colonialism, and that disprove me. So let us come together in the name of our nation to have our freedom of independence, to have our national umbrella, which means nation state, to live together, to build our culture, economy, and our Oromoness or Oromumma, what the enemy hates. Thank you for this presentation. Unfortunately, the coordinating committee didn't allow me to give you for a discussion. So more you can read from this document which today publicized. Thank you for the presentation. Dr. Bai, now you can take the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Almayo. I really appreciate time is getting a little bit hard on us. I don't want to waste time. Thank you to the two speakers who have made it abundantly clear historically. Ethiopia is a country that was created through extreme violence. And right now, honestly, we don't even need history. What they're doing as we speak clearly shows that they want to continue to keep the country together through violence that is not working. With that, let's move to the next item on our menu, which is a very good starter, entree, and that would be moderated by no other than Ade Kabane Kajela, and we have two qualified speakers who will educate us on the issue of economic and political integration of decolonized Ethiopian nations. Kabane, please. Are you there, Kabane? Ade Kabane, are you there?
Dr. Bairo, according to the PEP, the plan is the right for self-determination in Ethiopia. The speaker is John Young, Professor Young. You change the plan?
That comes after the economic and the political integration.
Okay, excuse me.
Yeah. Please, Dr. Kabane, are you there? And the speakers are Dr. Samuel, and Dr. Samuel, Dr. Tafari, and Dr. Adunya.
Baharu, Kabane just called me, telling me that she hasn't received the link, the Zoom link. Somebody could probably send her the link if they have her email address. In the meantime, I don't think I need any introduction. I could just go into my presentation, and as when she comes in, she could probably introduce my two colleagues, Sam and Adunya. Will that be okay?
Great, that would be perfectly fine. Howie, please could you shoot that link to Kabane, and then over to you, Tapari.
Okay. Here's what my colleagues and I are going to do in the next several minutes. Oops, let me. Yeah. I will use insights from the economics literature to try to convince you that the inferior economic outcomes in Ethiopia, rampant poverty, poor health, poor education, malnutrition, and all sorts of socioeconomic problems can be linked to ethnic polarization, a particular manifestation of ethnic fractionalization, which traces its origin to the foundation of Ethiopia as an empire state. My colleague Sam will invoke a branch of economics called identity economics to give you a theoretical overview of what might be the ultimate cause or cause for the ailments in the Ethiopian body politic. I'll then come back. I hope you'll not be tired of me. That will be the last segment that I am going to appear today on. So I'll come back and propose a solution, a way forward, if you will, that can address the various problems of the Ethiopian state. I'll talk about the common market also known as the Four Freedoms, as a potential solution for these problems. Ardunya will conclude things for us by discussing a particular institution that could support the common market idea that we are proposing. So without further ado, let me begin. The economics literature, for those who might be familiar with it, linking ethnic fragmentation and polarization. Remember, these are slightly distinct ideas. One is a particular manifestation of the other. So ethnic fragmentation and polarization and poor economic outcomes are linked, and there is ample evidence that we can provide. It wasn't, however, until Douglas North's Nobel lecture in 1989 that economists, mainstream economists, started producing the set of knowledge, the body of knowledge that we have on the nexus between ethnic fragmentation and polarization on the one hand, and inferior economic outcomes on the other. If you're interested, you might take a look at Alesina and LaFerrara's paper published in 2005 in the Journal of Development Economics to gain some, it provides a good summary of the literature. The literature has two broad strands. Some of the studies are conducted, use a cross-sectional approach, and others are more focused and use or utilize microeconometric analysis of the data. Taken together, a good survey of the literature that I've just talked about, you will come to the conclusion that ethnic fragmentation and polarization have significant negative effects on growth and development, either directly, I could cite a number of papers here, or indirectly through a number of channels or mechanisms. What are some of those important or main mechanisms linking ethnic fragmentation and polarization on the one hand and bad economic outcomes on the other? The first one is ethnic fragmentation and polarization causes or leads to inferior or poor institutional constellations. A seminal paper by Easterly and Levine, published in 1997 in the American Economic Review, and I could cite some others, additional others, offer this evidence, but institutional path or the institutional mechanism. The key channel, the important channel that I am going to emphasize in this presentation, in this talk, is the civil conflict or the civil war channel. Several studies, again, can be cited here. I will come back to this because it's more relevant in the Ethiopian context, and that's the key channel. The literature also identifies the competitive rent-seeking and the corruption channel. Again, we can cite a number of papers here. The other channel that has been identified in the literature is that explains the link between these two variables of interest is the public goods channel. In other words, ethnically asymmetric political representations in developing countries result in inadequate and inequitable provisions of public goods. A number of papers here, and in fact, there's a paper that is under review that myself and a couple of my colleagues at the University of Waterloo produced that supports this argument. An important caveat has to be made here, that being that ethnic fragmentation doesn't necessarily lead to bad economic outcomes, okay? Actually, we know from studies that the adverse impacts of ethnic fragmentation can be mitigated in societies that have developed institutions. So good institutions can mitigate the adverse effects of ethnic fragmentation on developmental outcomes, on growth and development. And also, not surprisingly, in high-income countries, ethnic fragmentation doesn't necessarily lead to, yes, of course, poor economic outcomes. Now, going back to the civil war and civil conflict channel, the key argument is, I wish I could get into this. I only have 10 minutes, but I'm just going to outline what the key argument here is, that ethnically fragmented societies are less cohesive. Sam will explain, as I said, a bit more on this using insights from identity economics. Okay, he'll take a broader approach, of course, less cohesive to tackle their collective action problems. They're characterized by conflicts, wars, worst of cases, of all sorts. Ethnically polarized societies are engaged in destructive civil wars. Let's look at the map of Africa. As we know, Africa is a continent where we have multitudes of ethnicities, okay? But it is also a continent where conflicts, ethnic-based conflicts, and civil wars and wars are its typical features, the continent's typical features. There are case studies, a number of case studies that show that, you know, Africa serves really as a good case study for this argument that I am making about the link between ethnic fragmentation and polarization and, of course, poor economic outcomes via the conflict channel or the civil conflict channel. Ethiopia, in my opinion, I will argue this in the paper that we are going to produce with my colleagues in more details, but I don't need to convince the audience on this panel that Ethiopia also serves as a case study for this argument that I just made, that Ethiopia or ethnic-based tensions and conflicts have been the defining features of modern Ethiopia. Contestations underlying the Ethiopian states over which destructive civil wars have been fought, all due to ethnic-based subjugation. Mokwe and Guluma argued their paper. By the way, they make an excellent case, and for anyone who is interested in looking at their paper, it will be made available on our website as a discussion paper. They didn't have enough time to really get into it. There's a time pressure, and they probably did not have sufficient time to elaborate on it. But anyway, what I am saying is the contestations underlying the Ethiopian state are due to this ethnic-based subjugation. The Ethiopian project can be equated, is actually equated with colonial domination of other groups by the Amhara. The ethnic-based civil wars before 1990, the conflicts between 1991 and 2018, when Ethiopia is considered to have emerged a rising nation, one of the elephants, whatever name that journalists like to give to a feel-good story. Between 1991, when the TPLF was at the helm, between 91 and 2018, even during those years, GDELD, a database that curates conflict-related deaths and events, episodes, documents tens of thousands of deaths in Ethiopia. And mind you, this is during the time when people thought that Ethiopia has emerged out of, you know, this recurrent conflict and whatnot. Anyway, of course, it's right upon us now. Ethiopia is about to disintegrate due to the number of conflicts engulfing it in Tigray, Oromia, Benishangul. I don't need to tell you about what is happening in Tigray and Oromia in more detail. It's available. It's the international media is covering. It's on the headline of New York Times and The Economist, and you know, BBC's headline news last night was the conflict in Tigray. What did Ethiopia gain from this? Of course, nothing. Unmitigated disaster. Millions died mainly due to the conflict directly, those who are engaged in warfare, and famines caused by the conflict. Tens, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars worth of economic loss. If we really estimate that the opportunity cost of the Ethiopian colonial project, resources that could have been put to better alternative uses. The Prime Minister himself came on national TV without any shame, talks about his government spending upwards of $6 billion at purchasing power parity. At constant dollars, it is less. In the last 8 months in Tigray, unsuccessful attempt to subdue the so-called Tigray Defense Forces. That's the minimum. So after 50 years of civil wars due to ethnic polarization, Ethiopia is dirt poor because of this phenomenon. I don't need to explain, you know, all the other dimensions of poverty that it is dealing with. Today, the country cannot survive, I tell you, without aid that is flowing from different quarters. And it's on the verge of collapse. I don't think anybody could help it. I'll stop here and pass a time to Sam to give his talk. Thank you.
I don't think the moderator is Inso Tafari. Please, do you mind to introduce Sam?
I'll be happy to.
Please, both of them. Appreciate it.
Okay. It's fine. Sam, call him Sam, is an associate professor of economics at the University of Regina in Canada. He is going to give us, I don't think I need to spend any time telling you all about his achievements and the papers he has published. You can look at his website, but he'll give us additional insights into this problem that we are trying to address here. It's you, Sam. Take over, and then I'll say a few words about Adunya as well after you finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Tafari. Thank you also for inviting me to participate in this forum, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this inaugural conference of the great Baro Tumsas Institute. It's also I'm also very fortunate to speak after both Tafari and Professor Makria, who have argued sufficiently why the very nature of Ethiopia necessitates liberation of ethnic communities, to put it simply. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present some economic theoretical arguments showing that when diverse ethnic communities are forced to live together under the yoke of a certain imperial power, conflict is cyclical, it's inevitable. As the empirical works by Dr. Tafari has shown, there will be inferior economic outcomes. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll go into the identity-based economic arguments, some microeconomic behavioral observations that result in those general conclusions and empirical outcomes that we have. I hope the illustration that you see on this first slide provokes some thought about what it really represents. Dr. Tafari concluded by saying that the negative economic consequence could be mitigated if there are better institutions, if there are already good institutions developed. But here we have the case where we have a very fully functional democracy. There is no ethnic marginalization of any sort, but still there is a hefty economic cost when we have different ethnic groups forced to live together. This is a case of the cost of official bilingualism in Canada. In 2012, the Fraser Institute estimated the annual cost just for the language enforcement, or the fact that the federal government has to operate with the two languages, amounts to 2.4 billion. This is just one type of cost. The other costs, people who follow the financial market know that the Canadian bond is relatively is of a higher interest rate, because the financial market attaches some premium to the risk of disintegration, because it's the country lives under constant fear of Quebec possibly breaking away from Canada. That is a risk, and there is a financial risk, and therefore, even with a fully functional democracy, even after every institutional problems are resolved, when there is any sort of discrimination, there is still a cost. So this is the minimum you can think of. But as we know from the development literature that Dr. Tafari presented, the cost is immense. When there is ethnic polarization, there is constant conflict. And the argument I'm making is that that conflict is inevitable. And that is because of what some of the things that Professor Makria said, things related to differences in values and norms, culture. That difference is reconcilable, and therefore there is a constant conflict. So that is pretty much what my presentation is going to go with. And I'm going to discuss the identity economics, which focuses on how identities in this case are social categories. Social categories are ethnicities, religion, and race. Race and ethnicity are not the same, as you know. And then how that affects behaviors and decisions. And so understanding this theory or framework, economic frameworks would enable us to answer some of the questions that we constantly face. We face constant questions such as, why are nation states? I'm now moving to the polar opposite of the case where different social categories are subjugated to live together. So the polar opposite is nation states, as you all know. So why are such nation states successful in building better institutions? So earlier, Dr. Tafari mentioned that better institutions help us to mitigate some of the negative consequences. But here we're going to say that actually even the likelihood of having these better institutions itself is rare when we have ethnic polarizations or we have different social categories with different norms and different values pulled together by force. So, and nation states are more egalitarian, less inequality. We know if we follow the literature on economic development, economic inequality itself has a negative effect on development because it results in social instability